Welcome to our Gender Equality Talks. My name is AnaMaria Vargas. I'm the Research Director of the Swedish International Center for Local Democracy. Today, I'm here with Augusto Lopez-Claroz, who wrote a wonderful book called Equality for Women, Prosperity for All. This is part of a series of talks where we will discuss gender equality, its relation to gender violence, political participation, education, and culture. In this talk, we will talk about women's political participation. We hope to inspire you and to join us in the fight for gender equality, not just because it's good for women, but it's also good for society as a whole. So, Augusto, let's start with our conversation. We want to know a little bit about what the data shows about women political participation. What are the numbers?
Typically, the way we measure women's political participation is in respect of a data set which actually exists and which tracks the participation of women in parliaments. There is an organization, one of the oldest multilateral organizations, called the Interparliamentary Union. It was actually created in the late 19th century, and it has its headquarters in Geneva, and they collect data on, for its member countries, what is the break between men and women in parliament. And they have been sort of tracking this for many, many years, and you can actually go to their website and look at a particular country that you may be interested in. What the data shows is two things. First of all, it shows that the number of women parliamentarians has been increasing in recent decades. If you go back to 1990, some 30 years ago, it was probably in the low teens, 10, 11, 12% on average. Today, it is closer to 23, 24%. Which is good. That's good news. In other words, women have entered into politics gradually, but persistently. Obviously, this is an average number for all the legislative bodies across the planet. The data shows, of course, a great deal of dispersion. You have countries like Sweden and Denmark and Mexico and Rwanda, where participation is high, 48, 49%. In the case of Rwanda, it's actually higher. Rwanda has the highest female participation in the world. I think it's 63%. But then you have countries like India, which is, as you know, a very populous country where it's 11%. Russia, which is another big emerging market with, I think, 12%. Brazil, which is another big country with a large population, it's also around 13, 14%, right? So it's a mixed picture. Right?
Okay, great. So we're still far away from equality in the parliament and political representation. And in the book, you argue about the use of quotas for parliaments and let's say also for local councils, since we are interested in local democracy. What is the empirical basis to justify the use of quotas?
Basically, because some countries have introduced quotas and others haven't, for an economist like myself, that creates a kind of a very interesting opportunity to see whether the introduction of quotas have had any kind of quantifiable impact, right? Or is this just a gesture, right? Something that does not really have any direct economic consequences, right? Maybe it's something that is good from a human rights perspective, but not really having any other additional repercussions. The data is actually very encouraging. Let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, if you compare the labor force participation rate of women in those countries that have introduced parliamentary quotas with those that have not, it is higher in the countries that have introduced parliamentary quotas. In other words, the quota by itself seems to have what we economists call very positive demonstration effects. Young girls watching television and seeing all these powerful parliamentarian women being chair of parliamentary committees and economic committees and other kinds of committees in parliament seem to say to themselves, hey, I like that. I want to be that, like that. And then they, they get the education and they get the training, and ultimately they use these powerful, influential women as role models. And that seems to have, for the population as a whole, a kind of encouraging impact, to get an education, join the labor force, right? There is an additional example which I find particularly fascinating, which has to do with the introduction of quotas in village councils in India. India does not have a quota for the federal parliament. India is a federal state, like Brazil, like the United States. And in the 1990s, however, the government told the state governments, if you want to introduce a quota for the representation of women in village councils, which is the kind of the smallest, the simplest administrative political entity at the level of the village, you are free to do so at 1/3, at 33%. And what happened is that some states introduced the quotas and some states didn't. And you can go back, 10 years after the introduction of the quotas, and you can ask yourself, well, did it make any difference? Is there any data that shows the impact of empowering women to sit on these village councils, right? Whereas before they were largely made up by men. And you can compare the states with the quotas and the states without the quotas. And what comes out of that exercise is very revealing. First of all, it shows that the structure of expenditure in the village councils that have introduced the quotas has shifted over time. More money is being spent on education, more money is being spent on public health, more money is being spent on things like water wells, right? Potable water wells, which improve the quality of life of the community, right? And all of these things, spending money on education, more money on education, they have an implication for economic growth in the future, right? And so that's one consequence, which I think is very important. The other one, which I also think is interesting, has to do with the attitudes of men. When the quotas were introduced, men were very skeptical. They thought, why are we doing this? Women should be at home. They should be taking care of the kids. They're, in any case, most of them uneducated. The men, of course, were also uneducated in the village councils, but that doesn't seem to concern them, right? But 10 years later, the men are voting for the women, and they seem to be more comfortable with the notion that having these women sit on the village council is okay with them, right? It hasn't undermined the social and political basis of the village. Quite the opposite. It has actually improved the quality of life in many ways. And so these are sort of pieces of evidence which have made us think that quotas actually, on the whole, are a good way to accelerate the empowerment of women politically. The alternative, of course, is that we wait 200 years, until the whole world is educated and prosperous before, we have the wisdom to actually vote for women in elections.
This is really interesting. It's to look into the local governments where we work and see whether they actually can open spaces for this kind of quotas and the important impact they have. And I agree, we shouldn't wait 200 years. I heard here in Sweden that we have to wait 100 years to achieve equal pay. And it really hurts me to hear that even in one of the most equal countries in the world, we still have to wait 100 more years. So we should definitely accelerate this and bring prosperity for all. But you also argue in your book that quotas could be used in other organizations, such as in the boards of private companies. And I even wonder about what also other organizations, NGOs, many other that work. Why should we also have quotas in such organizations? Why should the government be telling, for instance, the private sector that they should include quotas?
Well, again, here my answer is very much focused on the data. What do the data show, right? On your latter question, as should the government be telling the private sector what to do? they already do that, of course, right? There is a great deal of regulation of the private sector. Governments have laws on consumer protection. They have laws on the environment. They limit emissions. There are very strict laws in the banking sector to make sure that the banks are behaving properly and they're not cheating their clients and so on and so forth. So there's a great deal of regulation already. And the concept that the government, in terms of exercising its fiduciary responsibilities for good governance, can regulate the activities of the private sector, that's non-controversial. It's already happening, throughout the world. The issue of the government telling private companies that they should have, let's say, 30 or 35% or 40% representation on their boards by women, that's an innovation. And it's something that is relatively recent. It was actually done by Norway in the early part of the 2000s, when Norway, which is a country that had actually made a lot of progress in empowering women, and where we typically think that there isn't a great deal of gender discrimination, right? When you actually looked at the composition of the boards on publicly listed companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange, it turned out that on the boards, women were only 6% of the total, right? In a country that, is claiming to have already reached practically gender parity, in this particular area of activity, women were well behind. So what the government did is it established a voluntary quota of 40% for women. It gave the companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange a few years to achieve the quota. When this wasn't achieved, then the government introduced legislation which basically said, if you don't achieve this by 2008, then we will begin to take, sort of punitive measures against you, right? We will fine you. We will delist you from the stock exchange so that your shares can no longer be traded. And if you do not fulfill the target eventually, then we will simply shut down your company. We will dissolve your company. So that provided a kind of a very powerful incentive. And ultimately, Norway achieved the target of 40%. I mentioned the Norwegian case because it led to other countries doing the same, right? By now, probably something like 14, 15 countries in the world that have introduced quotas for women in corporate boards. Now, the evidence, again, as in the case of parliamentary quotas, is really quite encouraging. If you compare companies that have the quotas with companies that don't have the quotas, the companies that have the quotas, they have higher rates of return on equity, on sales, on investment capital. There is less turnover of staff and better retention of talent in those companies that have the quotas than don't have the quotas. There is a study which is fascinating. In the United Kingdom, there were a study done of 6,500 companies, and you split the sample in two groups: those companies that have 3 or more women on the board, and those companies that have less than 3 women on the board. And it turns out that in the companies that have more women on the board, the incidence of corruption, the incidence of scandals, the incidence of, the kind of headline-grabbing news that usually tarnish the reputation of a corporation, right, is much lower in the companies that have more participation on the boards. The IMF has done a couple of studies which are, again, fascinating and very interesting in their implications. They looked at the financial sector, just banks, right? Banks. And they discovered that those banks that have a higher share of women on their boards are associated with greater financial resilience, more stability. So if you want to put your savings in a bank, my advice to you, Anna, would be look at the composition of the board. And if it has no women, look for another bank. That's what the IMF is saying. Look for another bank, okay? And then they also looked at what they're called banking supervision boards. typically the central banks have some kind of institution called the Banking Supervision Board. They look at the stability of the financial system. And again, the IMF discovered that those banking supervision boards that have more women sitting on the boards, they are better able to guarantee financial stability in the country, right? So this is the data, right? I mean, I'm not making a dogmatic statement. The data strongly supports the presence of women on decision making in the corporate board and in finance.
So data gives us concrete arguments actually about the increasing of prosperity and many other values in society when we use actually these quotas. It's very interesting. We hear many times when we talk about quotas, but and I see quotas not in formal institutions, but I use quotas everywhere in everything I do. I want to see some kind of equality. And people come back and they said, shouldn't we focus on merit? Isn't merit what is really important?
Merit, of course, is important, but let me, again, very often these arguments are used somewhat superficially, right? Let me give you an example. Back in I think it was 2005, if I remember correctly, give or take a year, a new government came into power in Spain, and the prime minister said that he wanted to have 8 men and 8 women leading the 16 ministries that the Spanish government had at that time, right? The Spanish bureaucracy is relatively light, and they only had 16 cabinet portfolios, right? And immediately, people reacted and said, well, what about merit, right? Shouldn't the ministries go to the most qualified people in the country? And why are you saying that 8 of these ministers are going to be led by women, right? Until I remember Laura Tyson, who at that time was the head of the dean of the London Business School, heard of this argument, and she raised one very interesting question. She said, do you mean to tell me that in a country with 40 million people, you cannot find 8 fully qualified women, to head these ministries? I mean, is that the argument that is being made? That you see, this to talk about merit, seems okay, right? But if you really look behind it, it's a silly argument, right? Because what the prime minister was trying to do at that time is essentially, say, yes, we do have qualified women. We're going to make sure that they're represented in the high echelons of power, right? So now there is another argument that was put forward in Norway when the government announced back then, that they were going to introduce the quotas. It was a slightly different take on the issue of merit. What they said is that we don't have enough qualified women to serve on the boards. And so what's going to happen is that the few women that we have, which are qualified, are going to be serving on many different boards of companies, all right? And this will basically affect diversity adversely. Okay? And that was the argument. But then again, here the answer is that, yes, it is true that you don't have enough qualified women, but that is a gap which can be bridged. And in fact, in Norway, immediately training institutes began to appear, which would qualify women. They would teach them to read a balance sheet, to read an asset and liability statement, and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, we discovered that the kind of skills that you need to serve on the board of a company are not, it's not like getting a PhD in physics, right? Or mathematics, it's something that can be done in a short course, half a semester. And in fact, what happened in Norway is that many women enroll in these courses and they immediately qualify themselves. So it was a transitional issue. And so again, I don't think it was an argument not to introduce the quotas. It was just simply to recognize that, yes, we have to bridge that gap in qualifications, and that can be easily done over time.
Thank you. I think we are approaching the end, and we want to raise some of the things we hear on the street. We hear things such as, women are emotional and men are more rational. Or we hear things such as men are natural leaders. We hear things such as women need to speak up for themselves. They actually need to like raise their hand and go and mobilize, because what's the point on just giving them these positions if they're just not gonna speak up? Or that women aren't interested, that they just don't want to participate. What do we answer to those things?
Well, again, very often some of these questions reflect a little bit certain kinds of stereotypes, right? For instance, men are more rational and strategic. Women are emotional and irrational, right? Okay, so let's take that one first. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then how do you reconcile that with the evidence that is coming out that says that companies that have more participation of women on the boards are better run, they're more profitable, right? If women were irrational, if those women directors were bringing into the management of the company irrationality and emotion, you would expect these companies to do worse, not to do better, right? And so, that to me is a very weak argument. I think it's just stereotypes, that we are carrying for the last couple of 100 years, right? There is, I think, something that exists, but it's perhaps less of an issue now than it was 30, 40 years ago, which is a kind of a gap in qualifications, which reflects the fact that women in ages past did not receive adequate training, did not have access to higher education to the same extent as men. And for that reason, maybe sometimes they were not fully qualified. But this is a reflection of the past, and that gap has been narrowed in a big way. And for the argument that women aren't interested in politics, I am more sympathetic to that argument. I remember I was living in Russia in the 1990s. I lived there in Moscow for 4.5 years because I was representing the International Monetary Fund. And I would often see highly qualified women, who were scientists, they were in education, they were in medicine, they were in literature, in the arts, etc., and yet they were not present in parliament. And when I asked some of these very qualified women, how come, the parliament was singularly free of capable women, the answer would always be the same. Politics is a dirty business, they would say. I want nothing to do with it, right? And I can understand that. But I think that the participation of women in politics is going to clean up our politics. And I think for that reason, they should enter into politics, to bring a higher moral and ethical standard, right? So that when the politicians are in the news media, it's less about scandals and bribery and corruption, and it's more about public service and, intelligent and sensible legislation and laws that are passed because women are there in the decision making.
Well, thank you so much, Augusto. And I am really passionate about quotas. And as I said, not as something that is only for the formal, but actually something that you kind of have these lenses on daily basis. I want to recommend to all of you watching this episode of the Gender Equality Talks to take the opportunity to apply informal quotas everywhere you go, to apply if you're a local government official, to see that your programs and that your meetings and all the things you do, that you have equal representation. I was recently in Tanzania and conducting a research project, and I asked the local government to gather 10 representatives for conducting interviews, and I was welcomed by a room of 10 men. So I immediately said, no, I have to have women and have men. So I implemented a quota, I would say, even in these kind of informal settings. So I hope that all of you, and there are many issues that will require more representation of women, such as the climate talks and negotiations, and many other aspects, such business that you raise, political issues, but also in our daily programs and counters that we see this equal representation. Thank you so much, Augusto.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Anna.
Thank you, and hope you can watch some of our other episodes on violence against women, work, education and economic empowerment, and cultural questions.